Farmer Tom here. Welcome to the Farmer Tomcast and our ongoing series, Heroes of the Green. Today we have legendary writer Sharon Letts. How's it going, Sharon?
It's going great. Thank you. Hello from Baja California, Mexico today.
So, Sharon, can you tell the listeners your whole story about, and as it pertains to, cannabis?
I would love to. Thank you. And as a matter of fact, it's my 10-year anniversary next month for crossing over from mainstream media into the cannabis publishing space. So 10 solid years I've been writing full-time with a focus on patient profiles. The reason I do patient profiles is because I'm a stoner from the 70s, but I never realized it as medicine until I got up to Humboldt and I was working in media and I got breast cancer. But the interesting part of how I got up there is, my daughter, of course, wanted to follow her boyfriend up to Humboldt for school. And I thought, well, I was in Los Angeles as a writer-producer at the time, and I was doing documentary and magazine shows, and I thought, well, I'm getting older and I'm kind of tired of 15-hour production days, so maybe I'll send my resume up and write for a newspaper in a small town. So that's what I did. And a little paper called the Eureka Reporter, owned by a notoriously conservative businessman up there, Rob Arkley, actually brought me up to produce a news show. So I couldn't quite get away from television right away, but I ended up being the lead feature writer at the Times Standard. So everyone kind of knew me. I developed my own beat at the paper of domestic environmental articles and things. And so everyone knew I was open and kind of progressive. And when word got out that I had breast cancer, Pearl Moon of the Bud Sisters, a longtime judge at the Emerald Cup and longtime farmer and medicine maker in the hills in southern Humboldt, brought me a jar of cannabis oil to my door and said, here, take this, your breast cancer will go away. Well, I'm in mainstream media and I'm like, if this works, how come I don't know about it, right? Classic response. But that night she said, just take a little bit, like a half a grain size of rice with a toothpick. So that night, that's what I did. Very, very strong. It tests upwards of 80-90% THC. It's an alcohol reduction. And so it's a very strong resin concentrate that Rick Simpson found online for his own ailment almost 20 years ago and cured himself. So anyway, that night I didn't need a sleeping pill for the first time in many, many years. And, that's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the U.S. alone. Next day, I didn't need my painkiller. 2.5 weeks, all of my pharmaceuticals and supplements were gone for chronic pain, menopause, hormonal issues with thyroid disease, all kinds of stuff. I was 52, 53 years old at that point, and I was on, I was not well. So anyway, in 2.5 weeks, all the meds were gone. In 2.5 months, the cancer was completely gone with no surgery or chemo needed. So it was a calling. My joke used to be, God took this woman with a voice from Los Angeles, dropped her in Humboldt, and gave her cancer. But that's not too far from the truth. So I followed the calling, and I've been writing ever since. 10 years now, next month, of writing patient profiles in the cannabis space. And I write several series. Right now I have 7 series going for different magazines. All my work is on my website, SharonLetts.com. But it's been quite the experience, quite the 10 years.
Very cool. Well, can you start back in the beginning when you first came in contact with cannabis? Was it when you were a kid?
Oh yeah, I love that story. So I was considered not very bright, and everyone that knows me now knows that I am quite intelligent. But when all through elementary school, I was the one looking out the window, undiagnosed ADD. They didn't even have a name for it then. So I was not very bright. I couldn't focus. Then high school came, same thing. I was a D student, but I wanted to learn. I looked like I wanted to learn. I was attentive in class. I could not learn. And one morning I was walking to high school. I was 16 years old, sophomore in high school, walking to school with my sister and a friend. And she was always, getting into trouble and doing stuff. And so they ditched into a gas station bathroom and lit up a little pinner, probably Mexican weed, probably ragweed from Mexico at that time. I can still, my limbic system is still triggered by that scent and that taste. But so I took a couple hits out of peer pressure. I was a good girl. I think I was even candy striping at that point at the hospital. I was a girl. I had been a Girl Scout 5 years, you know. But that morning, so the first class was English, and I went, sat down. I was high. Walking to school, it was amazing. Everything was so crisp and bright. It was like I was seeing everything for the first time. So that was really interesting to me. And then in class, the teacher was out. The English teacher was out. So the substitute teacher said, I'm going to teach everyone how to write haiku, poetry. I banged out 10, boom, boom, boom. I looked up. Everyone was still working on their first one. I became a published poet first at 19 years of age. I'm getting full body chills telling the story again. It's so funny. But so yeah, poetry was my first writing. And then, you know, I became a gardener at 24. I was a flower gardener. I did perennial borders for wealthy people in Southern California. I was a gardener for 17 years. And then I was on local access in Southern California and then parlayed into television. But once I started smoking again, after my daughter was older, I never wrote anything without smoking. In-house television production, you know, a documentary magazine show for the History Channel on the Bible. I had to take a walk through the neighborhood off of Wilshire Boulevard to smoke to write. Same thing when I was up in Humboldt at the Times Standard. I have to go out and smoke to sit there and focus to write. So yeah, so my first experience, I didn't understand why it worked at 16, but it did work for me, along with, you know, quelling the pain of menstrual cramps. But I still didn't understand it as medicine until my cancer experience years later. Yeah.
Very cool. So, as you were growing up, what are the different kinds of varietal strains did you come across when you were growing up and smoking in Los Angeles?
You know, at that time, I mean, I started smoking, 1975 into the 80s. I got pregnant with my daughter in 88 and stopped smoking until she was 16. So up until from 75 to 88, it was whatever you could get on the market, you know. I mean, we didn't know what we were smoking. That's just how it was. I had no recollection of cultivar names or anything. Yeah, no. Not till I went up to Humboldt, actually. Yeah.
Okay, so what kind of strains did you smoke up there in Humboldt?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Writing now, you know, I've gone to the horticultural language. I call them cultivars now. I've changed my language a lot in writing because I come from mainstream and I want things to be correct. And I know if AP Style would accept the cannabis language, I know it would be the horticultural language. You know what I mean? Even though they still are saying marijuana. But anyway, lately I've been writing mostly about terpenes. I have a piece that is going to be online soon for, I think, Vegas Cannabis Magazine. I can't remember what magazine I wrote it for, but it focuses on terpenes because we know now that the sativa indica, I'm sure you've been talking about this with people, the sativa indica, two different plant thing is a myth. We have a broadleaf plant, we have a narrowleaf plant, and the feelings you get from the plants, let's just pretend you're smoking a sativa, right? What is in that plant? What's in that sativa? The terpenes are what gives the flavor and compels you to buy it at the dispensary, right? Because we have a symbiotic relationship with plants. The fragrance of a certain terpene, where the medicine is in the terpene, correct? That flavor and that scent we're drawn to because our body needs it in some way, chemically and medicinally. So what I've learned is not necessarily the cultivars I choose, but the first thing I ask is, do you have the lemonade terpene? Because the citrus terpene speaks to me because I suffer from hormonal depression. So I want things that are uplifting. So what I do now is I look for the terpenes that make me feel a certain way, and that's what I ask for, right? Yeah.
Very cool. So can you tell the listeners about your writing history? Let's dig a little bit deeper into it.
Okay.
Where did you start off? Where were some of the places that you worked? Who did you work with? All that kind of fun stuff.
Okay. So, like I said, I was a gardener for 17 years. I raised my daughter as a gardener. I had a truck. I had a Mexican crew that worked with me, Southern California. And I was my own boss for many years. And then I parlayed that into local television in Southern California. I self-cycled my television show called In and Out of the Garden. It was a visiting garden show. For those Californians familiar with Huell Hauser, I modeled my show after his, where I would just show up with the mic and walk around gardens and talk about what the garden was. And, I did shows like Catalina Island, their conservancy program out there, and I did the California desert. I did Balboa Park, Kate Sessions, who planted Balboa Park in the 20s. So I had a lot of fun with my first local access show. And then I raised my own money, which was a nightmare, and executive produced a series for PBS called Off the Beaten Path. And again, I focused on gardening, sustainable topics, art. We did a series in the Sonoma wine country, all different kinds of things. That was fun. And then I went to Los Angeles, and I started being a segment and field producer for national magazine and documentary shows. And that was really fun. And like I said, I worked on one show about the Bible for the History Channel. And I had grown up a Christian. And they assigned me, my segments were Noah, the Book of Ruth, The title was supposed to be The Bible Proven. Halfway into production, we had access to the top theologians and archaeologists in the world to prove the Bible. And halfway through production, I had a meeting with the executive producer and said, we have to change the title. So we had to change it to The Bible Revealed, because you really can't prove it. So that was an interesting project, my last mainstream project for television. So we moved on. And then, when I was up in Humboldt, I worked first for the Eureka Reporter. I'm a features writer, so I've always done human interest. I don't do crime, I don't do politics. So when I do my profiles on cannabis, my personal profiles, I have a formula that I use. I do the backstory, what were your first early experiences in cannabis, and then we go on to how did you get into the cannabis industry. And that's always fascinating to me, because all of my profiles everyone has an amazing story of getting into cannabis and in the industry especially, because it really takes a certain kind of person, as you know, to go into the cannabis industry. And then for instance, my What's in Your Stash series that's online for High Times. That was my sneaky way of putting a patient profile in what's considered a stoner magazine, right? Or a fluff. It sounds like a fluff piece, right? What's in your stash? But my whole thing is, when you start talking about someone's stash and looking into their stash, you are seeing actually how they are medicating and why. So every single one of my What's in Your Stash series is a patient profile. And most of my stories are like that. It all has to do, with the plant.